very good afternoon to you, ladies and gentlemen. I read the Vedic scriptures and I talk about them because I like them. I talk about leadership because I think we need to talk about it. Now you may ask, hey, why yet another discourse on leadership? We have had so many. And I would say we have had many discourses on doing things right. It's about time we started having a discourse on doing the right thing. Why? Because I see in front of me hope, and I see in front of me despair. I see all of these young minds, bright and bubbling with ideas, and I love it. But I also feel somewhere there is a lack of direction. I look at governments across the world, and I see scams. I see new apartheids replacing the old ones. If we do not have the apartheid based on race or color, I see apartheid based on caste, based on creed, based on religion, based on gender, based on sexual orientation. I look at the corporate world around me, and I see greed. I see brutalization of the environment. And the font of all morality. I see the religions around the world, and I see cynicism. And therefore I say that we need to talk about leadership. Now let me take you through the story of leadership, the history of leadership. Leadership, to begin with, was focused on the individual. The focus was on the person. So we thought of leaders. When we thought of leaders, we thought of heroes. We thought of martyrs. Blood needed to be shed, either your own or somebody else's, because that was the leader. And then there was a paradigm shift. He said, hey, hang on. This tends to make leadership genetic. And that just can't be it. And therefore we started talking about the situational theories of leadership, that leaders are actually created out of events. Leaders are actually created out of situations. And the behavior theory, where we say, hey, leaders are not just born, but they can actually be groomed. Leadership can be taught. And then we started talking about the charismatic leadership, the transactional leadership, the transformational leadership, and so on and so forth. And finally, this paradigm shift led to looking at not leaders, but leadership. And this was what social sciences had to say about leadership. It said leadership is a process. It's not a strength. It's not an attribute. It's a process. Leadership is a process by which a person influences others to accomplish an objective and directs the organization in such a way that makes it more cohesive and coherent. Brilliant. And we thought our problems were solved. I thought my problem was solved. And I gave this definition to many of my participants over the past 9.5 years that I've been teaching. And then the penny dropped. I asked some of my participants to name some leaders who met this definition. I got the usual suspects. I got Gandhi, I got Lincoln, I got Mother Teresa, but I also got Hitler. I also got Osama bin Laden. I also got Mussolini. And I thought to myself, there is something wrong. There's nothing wrong with the people who were giving me those names, but there was something wrong with this definition of leadership itself. It was missing something. It was missing something which was very, very vital. And that's when I started looking at what was the missing thing. The missing thing, ladies and gentlemen, was the moral compass. Was this distinction between right and what is wrong. And that's where I started delving into various textbooks and philosophies around the world to figure out, can I find something better? Can I find something better? Can I see what this morality is all about? Can I see what this ethicality is all about? And that's when I looked at morality and ethics. I'm using these two terms, but please note that I want to make it very, very clear that what I'm going to talk about is ethical leadership and not moral leadership. Morality, if you look at this, it comes from the root which means manner, character, the root moralitas. And it normatively refers to a code which distinguishes between good and bad. What is good? What is bad? And who tells you that? Probably a religion, probably a family, probably a community. But I'm not interested in talking about good or bad. Why? Because it is subjective. The moment you contextualize morality, things become completely different. So for example, if something is good, it does not have to be necessarily right all the time. And therefore, I looked at a different paradigm which was talking about ethics. And ethics was that branch of philosophy that involved systematizing, defending, and recommending concepts of right and wrong. And therefore, ethics is what I would want to talk about. It's different. For example, speaking the truth, it's supposed to be good, but is it always right? I suspect not. For example, killing is certainly bad, but is it always wrong? I suspect not. And therefore, what I would like to talk about is ethical leadership. Once again, I went through the entire plethora, the entire spectrum of philosophical texts, the philosophical books and the philosophical treatises to find out how can I figure out the difference between right and wrong. Because every time I spoke to people about ethics, they said, hey, hang on, all very fine, but how do I decide what is right and what is wrong? I got to know that there were two essential theories which dominated this philosophical thought of right and wrong. One was consequentialism, which very simply put says ends justify the means. The goodness or the badness, the rightness or the wrongness of an action depends on the consequences of that action. I see a problem with that. Because any means adopted to reach even a good end can never be right. An institution or even a country which is built on the blood and the gore of humanity cannot be right. And therefore this was problematic. And then I saw another theory and I said to myself, aha, I have the answer now. And this was the deontological theory that said, no, it's not the consequence of the action, but the action itself, which means the means themselves, have to be decided a priori as good or bad, irrespective of the consequence. Immanuel Kant talked about it. The earlier one was talked about by Bentham, John Stuart Mill's. Immanuel Kant even came out with a categorical imperative, universal good. I saw a problem here as well. How do I define a priori as to what is right and what is wrong? What yardstick do I use? Who do I believe? Where do I go? And that's where I decided to go back to the Vedic scriptures. Now, before I actually talk about what the Vedic scriptures talk about when it comes to leadership or when it comes to deciding between right and wrong, let me give you a little background. The 40th chapter of Yajurveda has 17 mantras. The mantras are the hymns. And those 17 mantras together are also called the Ishopanishad. And those of you who are reading the scriptures would be interested to know that Gita, the much revered book of the Indian culture, is actually an explanation of those 17 mantras. And lo and behold, the 40th chapter of Yajurveda gave me the answer as to what would Vedic leadership mean. And it said you have to look at two dimensions. One dimension which is important for any leader is ability to see things. Drashtva iti rishi. A person who has the ability to see things. A person who has the ability to anticipate the consequences of his actions. The ability to look around the corner. The ability to see what happens beyond. The ability to see what's going to happen 100 years from now. The ability to see as to what the future is or ought to be. And when I was talking about this, when I was reading this, I was also reminded of another book that I had read way back in my life. And that book was Alice in Wonderland. Many people ask me, why do we keep talking about vision? And the answer to this I have found for the first time in Alice in Wonderland, where Alice is lost and is walking and she reaches crossroads. And she's confused where to go. Fortunately for her, she sees a cat coming from the other direction. Those of you who read the book would know that that was a Cheshire cat. And Alice asks the Cheshire Cat, where do I go from here? Which road do I take? The cat says, that depends a good deal on where you wish to reach. Alice says, I don't much care where. The cat says, then it doesn't matter which road you take. But that was not the end of the passage. Alice realizes as an afterthought that perhaps it wasn't the best of the answers to give. So as an afterthought she says, so long as I reach somewhere. The cat says, oh, you will reach somewhere if you walk long enough. Two messages came out of this passage. A, if you do not know where you wish to reach, then do anything in life. It doesn't matter. But B, a more subtler message was that if you continue to work hard in your life, you will reach somewhere. But is that where you wanted to reach? And the day the answer to that question comes as a no, everything that you would have achieved till that point of time in your life will become meaningless. And therefore, the Ved says, the Yajurveda says, ability to see things. Key component, key dimension. And the second dimension, which is equally important, is integrity. Now, integrity also has been looked at by various philosophers in different ways, and the most simplest explanation they gave was walk the talk. Do what you say. The Yajurveda went a step beyond, and it said, Mansa Vacha Karmana. Say what you mean and do what you say. Which means your thoughts, your words, and your action, all of them have to be in consonance. And there's a second part of it too, that whatever you say has to be said same way with your entire body. The way, and this is the Rig way, that actually defined how a leader ought to communicate. What kind of an integrity a leader has to build. Samani va atmuti samana hidyani va samana vastu vo mana yatha vastu sahasani. The Rig way. It said there are three entities which participate. The heart, the mind, and the intellect. The heart, the seat of emotion. Of course, you can point a finger at me and say, hey, speaker, Mr. Speaker. Emotions originate in the limbic system, which is next to the hypothalamus. Correct? Metaphorically, however, we say that emotions originate in the heart. Mind is the seat of desires and consequently takes care of the subconscious decision making. And the intellect is the seat of logic, rationality, and decision making and takes care of the conscious decision making process. And therefore, what the Rigveda says is that as a leader, you must say the same thing with your emotions, with your heart, with your mind, and your intellect. Whatever you say through your heart gets manifested through your facial expressions and your tone and tenor. Whatever you say through your mind gets manifested through your body language. And whatever you say through conscious decision making of your intellect gets manifested through your words. Samani Vakuti, Samana Hidyaniva, Samana Suvokana. You have to make sure that all three are in consonance. And then it went a step beyond and it said, whatever you do, whatever you say, whatever you mean has to be for universal betterment. It has to be for good of everyone. Sarva asha mammitram bhavantu. Sarve bhavantu sukhina. And therefore, the question came as to how do you combine these two? Because if you could combine these two dimensions, that's where the person was a leader. If you have the ability to see things, but you did not have the integrity, in that case, you were Machiavellian. The Hitler would go in there. The problem was solved. The only thing that remained to be seen was that, okay, I got the solution, but how do we develop this ethical leadership in people? And the answer came, then again, once again, from the Yajurveda. And it said, development of your conscience through the understanding of your own self your purpose in life, and your relationship with your universe and the extension of your obligations to it, and subsequently acting in accordance with this developed conscience. You don't have to read the scripture to figure out the difference between the right and wrong. I read it there though. You don't have to ask somebody. You don't have to go to an organized system to let you know what is right and wrong. But you listen to your conscience. And you develop this conscience. Just like your mind, you need to develop this conscience. Now, the first time when I proposed this theory, a friend of mine asked me, Himanshu, great. But you see, you have assumed that you all know what conscience means. What is this conscience? And therefore, I dived once more into the Upanishads this time and figured out what conscience was. And conscience itself was defined. Okay, this doesn't seem to be working yet. Conscience itself can be defined as that inner voice that impels us towards that which makes us fearless, blissful, and passionate, while eliminating fear, doubt, and shame. And this, the Upanishadic theory, gave the answer as to how do you determine what is right and what is wrong. And the three words that it used were lajja, bhaya, shanka. And it said, before you perform any action, do you get any of these three? Lajja, shame or embarrassment, bhaya, fear, and shanka, doubt. And it said, if you feel any of these three, it's wrong. But if you do not feel any of these, it's right. A simple theory. However, there were the naysayers. And somebody said, hang on. Sometimes when we do even the right thing, we feel afraid. What if it is going to cost my life? And therefore, how do I develop this conscience is what you need to tell me. And this is the thought that I want to leave you people with. You develop your conscience by developing the fire within, where F stands for fortitude, courage. Please do not confuse between bravery and courage. Bravery is when you show dauntlessness. You're undaunted in face of an external threat. But courage is when you master the fears inside. The fear of failure, the fear of success, the fear of death, the biggest of them all. And Vedic literature tells you that if you look at death as the beginning of the new life, you will not be afraid of it. Unfortunately, most of us look at death as an end, the end of everything. But the Vedic literature says, no, not at all, it's just a milestone in the everlasting journey of the soul. And therefore, what you need is fortitude. IR stands for introspective reflections. You need to think about your swadharma, the purpose of your life. You need to understand how you connect with the universe around you. And you need to understand what your duties are. What is it that you can contribute to mankind? What is it that you can contribute to this universe? And finally, you need to have E, which is equanimity. And equanimity means sambhava. In the face of happiness, in the face of sadness, you try to keep your mind still. Because the Yajurveda says, Yajjagrato durmudaiti, daivam tadu suktasya tathaiveti, duram galam jyotisham jyotirekam tanme manashik sankalpamastu. That this mind of ours can fly in a state of wakefulness as far away as it can when you are actually asleep. And therefore, you need to control this mind to get this equanimity. And how do you control your mind? By controlling your breath. Once again, another Vedic scripture, the Patanjali Yoga Shastra comes in and says, master your breath. The moment you start controlling your breath, your mind will automatically get controlled. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the fire. And I ask you, I implore you to develop this fire within, because what we need today is a moral compass. The past belonged to those leaders who did well, but the future is going to belong to those leaders who not only do well, but also do the right thing. Thank you very much.